Okay, good evening, everybody, and you're very welcome here to Keele Hall tonight for the latest instalment in our, we're very excited about our race equality lecture series here at Keele University. So our guest speaker today is Professor Kalwant Bhopal from the School of Education at the University of Birmingham. So Kalwant is a Professor of Education and Social Justice, Professorial Research Fellow, and the Deputy Director of the Centre for Research in Race and Education. I know some of you have travelled long distances to be here tonight, so I appreciate it very much, and we all do. And I just want to let you know that the bar is open here at Keele Hall after the lecture. I don't mean right now. It is open right now. And also, some of us plan to continue the discussion there afterwards, and you're all very welcome to do that. So this lecture series, the Race Equality Lecture Series, has been organised by my colleague Udeni Salmon, who's here tonight in the front row. And Udeni's very kindly invited me to deliver this introduction. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Shane O'Neill. I'm a Professor of Political Theory here. I'm also the Dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences, and I could say other things, but I'm also co-chair of the Race Equality Charter Self-Assessment team, which is probably the most important reason why I'm giving this introduction. And we, as an institution, signed up to the Equality Challenge Unit's Race Equality Charter for Higher Education Institutions about 12 months ago. And we're engaging in a process where we're trying to self-critically reflect on the extent to which we as an institution are part of a racially unequal world, and try to develop then an action plan so that we can at least play our part in trying to overcome some of those issues that are at work in continuing and allowing those inequalities to persist. The Race Equality Lecture Series has been a very important part of that work. It's been developed partly because we're undertaking this task, but also in response to the rising tide of racism around the world, and I think particularly to coincide with the widespread recognition of racism as a long-standing problem in higher education institutions. So I think it's very... One reflection I have, I'm adheres to social justice, really coming from the discipline of politics. And I'm very conscious that in a lot of the literature, even courses on social justice, modules on social justice that you get in very good universities around the world, often issues of race equality may not make it onto some of those modules, whereas issues about gender and culture have done so and have made a lot more progress, I think, in being seen as topics that cannot be avoided if you're going to teach a module on social justice, whereas I have to say race, it's much more patchy, and I think there's something really for us all, well, certainly for people in my discipline, to think about. And I actually think in part, when I think about the explanation for that, I think in part it is because political philosophy, particularly in the Anglo-American world, is just primarily, it's a white discipline. There isn't enough representation of black colleagues engaging in that kind of literature, because if there were, this would not be the situation that we find ourselves in spite of work of people like myself and other white scholars who are trying to address that issue. So as part of this lecture series, Udeni has invited writers and activists to share their experiences with staff, students and the wider public here. And we've already had 12 events this year with around 700 people in attendance so far. And an even wider audience have been reached through social media. So I think we can be confident that our message has reached a wider audience than we probably thought we would in the first instance. I think the importance of race, diversity and equality in university has never been more important. So recent campaigns, you can think of things like Why Isn't My Professor Black?, the widely reported racist incident at Nottingham Trent University earlier this month, and problems with the degree attainment gap for non-white students. These are all serious issues that I think have to give us pause for thought and serious reflection on what is going on. So given the problems of racism in our sector, we do expect universities to demonstrate and put funding into anti-racist activities. And certainly in my role as a faculty leader and as a Pro-Vice-Chancellor for the university, I do see part of my responsibility to try to empower all those who are working with me and try to address issues of social justice in every aspect of our work, including this work in terms of the Race Equality Charter. So one other thing we're doing, you're friends with Derek McGee, who we recently took from Southampton, and Derek is here leading an Institute for Social Inclusion, which is one important part of development around important research in the agenda of inclusion very broadly, but for me that hopefully will include some high quality research and issues related to race in the future. Kalwant's research focuses on the achievements and experiences of minority ethnic groups in education. She's conducted research on exploring discourses of identity and intersectionality, examining the lives of black minority ethnic groups, as well as examining the marginal position of gypsies and travellers. Her research specifically explores how processes of racism, exclusion and marginalisation operate in predominantly white spaces, with a focus on social justice and inclusion. She's visiting professor at Harvard University in the Harvard Graduate School of Education and visiting professor at King's College London in the Department of Education and Professional Studies. The title of Kalwant's lecture is BME Experiences in Higher Education, Social Justice, Inclusion and White Privilege. Kalwant will examine recent statistics on the representation of BME staff and students in higher education and explore how processes of racism, exclusion and marginalisation continue to disadvantage BME groups. She'll also explore BME academic flight from higher education while focusing on issues of equity and social justice. So her talk clearly relates to her wider work on how white privilege works to disadvantage those from BME backgrounds. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm Kiel welcome to Kalwant Bhopal.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed, and it's nice to be back at Kiel, although it's very cold up north, I must say. Much colder than it was down south. Okay, so on the face of it, policy making paints a positive picture of inclusion in higher education. We have the widening participation agenda, which was introduced by the new Labour government in 2000 and 2003 to address the attainment gap for disadvantaged students. That was a hugely important piece of legislation and still continues today in different forms. The Equality Act was introduced in 2010. The Equality Act is a very important piece of legislation because it brings together all previous legislation into one single act. The reason why it's important is because it contains protected characteristics, of which race is one. The Athena Swan Charter was introduced by the Equality Challenge Unit 10 years ago. The Athena Swan Charter is also very important because it was used to progress and advance the position of women in STEM subjects. That's science, technology, engineering, maths and medicine. 10 years since its introduction, the Athena Swan Charter has shown to have had a significant influence on the progression of women in STEM subjects. However, in my work, I argue that the main beneficiaries of Athena Swan have been white middle-class women. The Race Equality Charter was introduced in 2015. It works in a similar way to the Athena Swan Charter, where universities are awarded only a bronze award because it's very new. And 21 institutions applied for the award and only 8 were awarded. Last year, this number increased to 9. We've also had, so on the face of it, policy making looks really good and positive. And on top of that, we've had an increase in the numbers of black and minority ethnic students attending higher education institutions. For example, 29% of all entrants to full-time first degrees were BME in 2015 and 16. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more and show you what I mean by that data. But also to be aware that I use the term BME with caution because there are differences within and between different BME groups. So we have to be careful how we use that particular term. It is a term that I use in my work because it is a term that government policy making uses and the ECU use in their work as well. So on the face of it, policy making and an increase in student numbers in the BME shows that we're doing something right. However, despite significant advances in policy making and an increase in the BME student body, inequalities continue to persist in higher education. But don't just take my word for it, let me show you the evidence. Okay, so BME make up 14% of the minority ethnic population. Excuse me. That's from the last census data. So in 2015 to 2016, 98.2% of UK students disclosed their ethnicity. And as I've said, that there are differences within and between those groups. A total of 21.8% were BME, and those were the differences. But the proportion of students who are BME has significantly increased from about 15% to approximately 21.8% 10 years, over a 10-year period. But the proportion of students who have shown the most significant increase are black students. So out of all those BME groups, it is black students that have shown the highest number of increase. However, yet these are the groups that continue to experience the most significant disadvantages. And this is what I'm going to show you how that happens. So, if you are a white student, you are more likely to receive a first or a 2-1 compared to BME students. There is a BME attainment gap of 15.0 percentage points. And this is the most recent data that's available on this, so that's 2015 to 2016. As I've said, there are differences within and between the different ethnic groups. So Chinese, Indian and mixed students are more likely to receive a first. But again, as I've said, if you're a black student, you're less likely to receive a first or a 2-1. So there are differences within and between those categories. So if you're black, you're less likely to receive a 2-1 or a first. Of course, it's extremely important to look at intersectionality. We cannot look at ethnicity as a variable on its own. So I thought it would be important today to look at those figures around ethnicity and gender, for instance, and how those particularly play out when we're looking at how disadvantage works. So we've seen that the proportion of female students has also shown an increase in 2015 to 16. So females make up the majority in UK higher education, and that's 56%. With the exception of research postgraduates, women make up the majority at every degree level. So I'm going to talk about research postgraduate degrees in a minute as well. The majority of part-time students are female, but the greatest degree attainment gap is for BME men rather than BME women. So that's why it's important to look at why intersectionality itself is very important. So let's talk about inequality, inequality, and inequality. So even when BME students achieve good A-level grades compared to their white students on average, there are, as I've said, differences within that category between Indian, Chinese and black students. So even when they do receive good A-level grades, they are less likely to be able to apply to selective universities such as Oxford or Russell Group. So, for example, and my research shows this, if you have a bright student who's attending a state comprehensive school, they are less likely to be encouraged to apply to Oxford or Cambridge. They are less likely to know that if you are going to apply to Oxford and Cambridge, you have to apply in September. If you want to apply for certain degrees, you have to do an entrance test. So applying to elite universities such as Oxbridge it's not the same process as going through UCAS, where the deadline is December. So bright BME kids in state schools are less likely to know that. Mediocre kids in independent private schools have members of staff dedicated to send their children to Oxbridge. So they know the deadlines, they know the tests, they're trained for interviews, and they know exactly how to perform that notion of middle classness through interviews and tests. And my research shows that, and it's in the book. So when they do apply, however, they are less likely to be offered places compared to white students with comparable A-level grades. So even when they get the A-level grades, they are less likely to be offered a place. And we know that David Lammy has said that this is a process of social apartheid that's taking place in our universities. And this is data from last year, 2017. So our research shows, as does the ECU, that BME students are less likely to attend Oxford, Cambridge and Oxbridge universities, and they are underrepresented in these prestigious elite Russell Group universities. There's also recent evidence to show that black students are more likely to drop out of university. And some of the reasons that they cite are a Eurocentric curriculum and experiences of racism. And Shane already mentioned the experiences of Nottingham Trent, but also there was an example of Exeter recently. I don't know if you remember that. And yesterday, this was brought to my attention. I don't know if you can see it. Black people in UK 21 times more likely to have their university applications investigated, UCAS figures show. That was only yesterday. I haven't got hold of the figures yet, so I'm just going by what was reported in The Independent, but I'm trying to get hold of that report and those figures. So I mention that with caution, but I'm sure The Independent have done their homework. So racism is alive. Once privileged, always privileged. So I think it's really important when we look at inequalities in higher education, we cannot look at those inequalities in isolation, and they're not disparate from previous experiences. So what I argue in my work and in my book is that we have to take a step back and look at individuals' experiences at primary and secondary level to see how they've got where they are at HE. And I talk about this through a process of once privileged, always privileged. So I thought these statistics you may find quite interesting. 6.5% of school children in the UK attend independent schools compared to 93% of children who attend state schools. 55% of privately educated children progressed to Russell Group institutions, including 6% who went to study at Oxford or Cambridge. And that was last year. So given that it's only 6.5%, I think those numbers are quite significant. So I argue that once you're already in a position of advantage, you are privileged. And what happens is advantage is awarded to those who are already in an advantageous position. And this isn't just based on ethnicity and race, it's also class, it's also wealth, and it's also income related, parental income related. And I argue that these processes of exclusion are based on the perpetuation of white privilege, which is the access to social, cultural, and economic capital. I just want to read something out to you, if I may, just to demonstrate that. So if you can, take your mind back to Monday the 13th of April 2015. Monday the 13th of April 2015 was a typical day in modern British politics. An Oxford University graduate in Philosophy, Politics and Economics, PPE, Ed Miliband, launched the Labour Party's General Election Manifesto. It was examined by the BBC's political editor, Oxford PPE graduate Nick Robinson, by the BBC's economics editor, Oxford PPE graduate Robert Peston, and by, you know what's coming, and by the director of the Institute of Fiscal Studies, Oxford PPE graduate Paul Johnson. It was criticised by the Prime Minister, Oxford PPE graduate David Cameron. It was defended by the Labour Shadow Chancellor, Oxford PPE graduate Ed Balls. Elsewhere in the country, with the election 3 weeks looming away, the Liberal Democrat Chief Secretary to the Treasury, Oxford PPE graduate Danny Alexander, was preparing to visit Kensington and Surbiton, a vulnerable London seat held by a fellow Lib Dem minister, Oxford PPE graduate Ed Davey. In Kent, one of UKIP's two MPs, Oxford PPE graduate Mark Reckless, was campaigning in his constituency, Rochester and Strood. Comments on the day's developments were being posted online by Michael Crick, Oxford PPE graduate and political correspondent of Channel 4 News. So what do all these individuals have in common? They're white, they're men, they all went to Oxford and they read PPE. So, as I said, it's really important to look at, of course, what happens before you enter higher education, but also what happens after you enter higher education, because there's a huge amount of evidence, and my own research included, which shows that the decisions that students make in the final year of their undergraduate degree has a huge impact in terms of social mobility and access to the labour market. So that decision-making process in the final year of undergraduate study is hugely important for future life chances, particularly in relation to social mobility and access to high-paid jobs. So whilst BME students have continued to show higher rates of transition to postgraduate taught degrees such as masters, it's white students who continue to have higher rates of transition to postgraduate study. Why is that important? For higher education, that's extremely important because we know the way in which the market is now working. In order to become an academic, you must have a PhD. And if BME students are not making that transition to do a PhD, then our labour market for HE will not be as diverse as we would like it to be. So in my work, I argue that the access to financial and economic capital affects these transitions to postgraduate study, which in turn affects access to the labour market and social mobility. And my study found that it was particularly young black men who were unable to self-finance themselves to do a PhD, because the only way that they could do that was through a bursary, and it's extremely competitive for them. Indian students, however, both male and female, were more likely to have access to financial and economic capital, which would enable them to do a PhD. So again, it is the black students that are hugely disadvantaged. And from my research, I show that they're disadvantaged, unfortunately, at all levels, from primary, secondary, and so on. So BME students then, and again, it's not just the black students, it's also Pakistani and indeed Bangladeshi students, incur an ethnic penalty in the labour market. They are more likely to be unemployed 6 months after they graduate compared to their white counterparts, but it also varies by ethnic group, as I've just said, but also gender and geographical location. So if you're located in the south of England, you are less likely to experience unemployment than you are in the south. So there are all these multiple complex factors that affect these transitions. Okay, so now I'm going to talk about staff in HE, because I think it's really important to examine how this reflects in terms of what the picture is, certainly in relation to looking at the most recent data that we've got there, which is the 2015-2016 statistics. So 8.9% of UK staff identified as BME during this time, and the proportion of staff who are UK BME has also increased, as have student numbers. So it's also important here to look at non-UK and UK figures for both staff and students, because one of the things that I found in my research is, and I've spoken to a lot of vice-chancellors and a lot of pro-vice-chancellors and visited many, many universities, and there's always a claim that, yes, we're very diverse, we have a great diverse student body, but when you look down at the statistics and the figures, they are looking at their international representation. So our home BME students are actually disadvantaged at the expense of international students. And why are international students important? Because they pay $15,000 or double the fees that students pay. I was about to swear then. I'm not allowed to swear, am I? Because I'm being recorded. Good job I didn't swear. So the proportion of UK and non-UK staff has significantly increased. However, only 4.2% of BME staff are in senior managerial positions. So I'd just like to ask you a question. Out of the 154 vice-chancellors we have in the UK, how many do you think are from a British BME background? 0, 2, 1. Oh, come on, it's more than that, it's 3. I can name them for you if you like. So out of 154 HEIs in the UK, we only have 3 BME vice-chancellors. So a higher proportion of... Yeah, I've done that one, haven't I? No, that's important. So UK BME staff then are underrepresented, as I've just said, at the highest contract level, and they're overrepresented in the lowest. So we've only got, in percentage terms, we've only got 1.6% of heads of institutions in the UK. A higher proportion of both UK and non-UK BME staff in 2015-16 were on research-only contracts compared with white staff, but there were higher rates of white staff on teaching and research contracts compared to BME staff. So that's just to give you a picture of what's going on. I thought it was really important for me to show you this table, just because it's quite shocking. Well, I think it's quite shocking anyway. So we have 13,295 professors in HEIs in the UK. The total of BME is 1,150, and as I keep saying, there's differences within and between the different ethnic groups, which is important for us to talk about. Only 80 of those professors are black, of which only 21 are women. and then the other numbers, I think, speak for themselves. And I thought it would be also good to give you that table in terms of comparing it to non-professors. So you've got a picture of HE. And again, it's really important for us to talk about intersectionality and not look at identities as disparate. It's important to look at how these intersect. In terms of gender, women make up 54.1% of those working in HE. Men are more likely to work full-time than women. Men are more likely to be on permanent contracts. Men are more likely to be in senior decision-making roles. Women just comprise 20.4% of VCs, and men are more likely to earn over $55,000 than women. It's 65% of men. So how does that break down in terms of ethnicity? Male staff from BME backgrounds are more likely, only slightly though, the percentage is quite small, to work in HE compared to women. White men are more likely to be professors than any other group, and then it's white women. Only 7.3% of BME men are professors compared to only 2% of which are BME women. So, as I said at the beginning, on the face of it, it looks as though we're doing really well in terms of policy making. But if we drill down and look at the statistics and the realities of HE for some BME groups, the picture doesn't look good. It does not paint a positive picture whatsoever. So why is this happening? Why is this going on? So we have an assumption, don't we, that our universities and higher education are liberal places, they are progressive, and they're also should be challenging but yet safe spaces at the same time. However, there's a huge amount of evidence to show that processes of overt racism, exclusion and marginalisation continue to exist in higher education. There are stereotypes of students. White middle-class students are seen as ideal, Chinese students are seen as quiet and passive, and black and Muslim students are seen as loud, challenging and aggressive. And we have processes of unconscious bias that continue to exist in higher education, where there are certain expectations from students and indeed staff. So there are processes of racism that continue to exist within this so-called liberal academy. So how can we explain it? Well, I can explain it through, and I explain it in my work through the concept of white privilege. I think it's important to define and describe what we mean by white privilege. And, you know, forgive me for using Peggy McIntosh's work because it is very old, it's 1988, but it's something that I always come back to because I think she gives a fantastic definition of what we can of how we can understand white privilege as a discourse and how it's used in everyday life. She says white privilege is like an invisible, weightless knapsack of special provisions. So you've got this on your back and you walk around and it's got maps in it, it's got passports, code books, visas, clothes, tools, blank checks. It means you won't get stopped at customs, you won't get stopped by the police if you're driving a flash car, etc., etc. And the fantastic work by Derek Bell, which is based on critical race theory, describes white privilege as racist hierarchical structures which govern all political, economic and social domains. Such structures allocate the privileging of whites in all arenas, including education. So whiteness or white privilege isn't a simple term, and in my work I argue that there's different shades of whiteness. There's acceptable and non-acceptable forms of whiteness. I talk about white privilege as a discourse and a concept, but also I try and break it down and argue that, first of all, we can't understand whiteness on its own. It's got intersectionalities around social class and accent and dress and the presentation of self, but also there's different shades of whiteness. There's acceptable and non-acceptable forms of whiteness. So gypsies and travellers, for example, that I've carried out a lot of research with, those communities, whilst they have the identity of whiteness, they don't have those privileges that whiteness affords. So it's important to look at it as a kind of I describe it as like a wavy concept because it can change at different times for different groups. So I've talked about policy making and I've said that on the face of it, it's positive. But who benefits from policy making? Or who, more precisely, who benefits from white policy making? And Derek Bell, in his work, when he talks about this notion of the ways in which policy manifests through whiteness is that policy making will only happen in, for instance, in my opinion, in higher education, if it benefits whiteness and white privilege. So, Derek Bell says, whites will advance the cause of racial justice only when doing so coincides with their own self-interest. And my colleague David Gilbourne, he says the continued promotion of policies and practices that are known to be racially divisive testifies to a tacit intentionality in the system. So he argues that it is intentional, the way in which policy and the discourses and narratives around policy making work to disadvantage minority groups. And Gloria Ladson-Billings says that whites are the main beneficiaries of educational policy making, even though they are designed to serve the marginalised. So in terms of affirmative action in the US, who do you think are the main beneficiaries of affirmative action? I'm sorry, I forgot the reference for it. But anyway, who do you think have been the main beneficiaries of affirmative action in the US?
White women.
Yes. Who said that?
Because I'm from the US, I remember.
Oh, you know, yes, you're from the US. So the main beneficiaries... Excuse me, I will dig out the reference. I thought I had written it down. The main beneficiaries of affirmative action in the US have been white women. Is it white middle-class women? I'm not sure. Yeah, I think it's... Don't quote me on that because I need to check that. But I know it's definitely white women. But I think it might be white middle-class women. So affirmative action has been around a long time in the US, and I don't profess to be an expert on US relations or the political or social climate, but I do know that the main beneficiaries of affirmative action throughout the years have been white women. So from this critical race theory perspective, then you could argue, if we're looking at the Race Equality Charter, is that universities will only use or sign up to the Race Equality Charter because it benefits them, because they think that it's going to increase their student numbers and they think that they will go up in the league tables. So that's one way of looking at policy making through a critical race theory lens. So when I was thinking about what I was going to say today, I dug out these two quotes, which I think are quite old, really, 2000 and 2001. And I've called this slide New or Just Old Racisms because we seem to be having the same conversations that we've been having for many, many years. And there's certainly, I'm not so sure whether it has been this year, certainly there was this notion post-Obama that, you know, we live in a post-racial society, race has been dealt with, racism doesn't exist anymore, we've got a black president, etc., etc. So I dug out these quotes, and I think that they're really important. One refers to the US, and the one at the bottom refers to some research that Martin Myers and I did, looking at what happens in rural schools, primary schools, when black parents complain about racism. And if you're interested in that study, I can give you the reference. So if you're interested in this area, I do urge you to go and read Bonilla, Silva and Foreman. Their work is absolutely outstanding and is really, really just fantastic. So if you're interested in racial inequalities, their work is fantastic. A new race talk, and this was 18 years ago, they argue, a new race talk has emerged in the reproduction of white supremacy. It allows whites to appear not racist, preserve their privileged status, blame blacks for their lower status, and criticise any institutional approach, such as affirmative action, that attempts to ameliorate racial inequality. Now, that quote would probably, I would say, would be applicable today post-Trump. Would you agree? So that was in 2000. And then we did, as I said, we did this research around 2000. I think it was what we did with you as well, Derek. I think it might have been part of that study when we looked at gypsies and travellers and racism on the South Coast. And we said, to argue that post-Macpherson has resulted in a post-racial society is utterly absurd. Such discourses serve only to further disadvantage and marginalise black and minority ethnic communities. Racism, we argue, exists at every level of our society. It permeates our schools, our colleges and our universities. It is alive in all elements of society, our popular culture, our media and the social spaces that we occupy. And I think that quote is relevant today in 2018. Okay, so I'm going to talk now So that's all kind of like the theory and the background and the evidence. And now I'm going to talk about a study which supports everything that I've said, if that makes sense. So this is a piece of research that I did that was funded, a major piece of research that was funded by the Equality Challenge Unit. And one of the things that the Equality Challenge Unit wanted me to look at was minority ethnic flight from the UK. Now, this was done just before Brexit, pre-Brexit. So I think that the findings would probably be different post-Brexit. So there's not much evidence, sort of written evidence, that anecdotal evidence and Home Office evidence to suggest that BME individuals are more likely to leave the UK to work in the US and other countries from UK higher education. But as I've said, ours was the first study that looked at this, apart from the anecdotal and small amounts of Home Office evidence that we found. So the ECU wanted us to look at reasons for overseas HE migration, push and pull factors, and if this was happening, what could HEIs be doing to keep this talent that we're supposed to be losing overseas. So we sent a questionnaire to all higher education institutions in the UK. We analysed our data quantitatively. We did 41 in-depth interviews with people that were here, had previous overseas experience, or were based overseas. And we analysed our data through NVivo, which is a package that's used to analyse it. So how many people do you think responded to our questionnaire, given that we sent it to all the HEIs, 154 in the UK? 1, 2, 20? Any numbers? 15. Oh, come on. You're not very positive, are you? We got 1,200. I nearly fell off my chair when we got that. I wasn't expecting that. So that was fantastic. I would have been not being a quantitative analysis, I would have been quite happy with 500, because I know that with 500 you can run regression analysis and chi-square and make claims of generalisability. So this was absolutely fantastic. We were very, very delighted with this result. One of the things that I was unhappy about and wanted to pursue was that we got 74% of respondents in traditional old red brick universities and only 21% in post-1992. And when we were getting the questionnaires back, we saw that this was going to be an issue. So we made a conscious effort to send follow-up emails to the post-1992 respondents, because we wanted to, because my hunch is, and this is just a hunch because I haven't got the data, I would need more respondents, is that there are differences in the experiences and responses of those working in traditional and post-1992 universities, and I think that it would have been good if we had more data to analyse. So we did this, and the response rate didn't increase. We did it again, and it still didn't increase. And then we sort of wanted to find out why we felt this was happening, and we had a few conversations. And some of the reasons that were given, and these are anecdotal, was that number one, academics in post-1992 universities were too busy because they were teaching, so they didn't have time to fill out the surveys. And number two, the ethical processes were very different, apparently, in terms of being allowed to fill them in. Again, I don't know if that's the case, because we need more numbers than that to do an analysis on it. So that's a shame. So, yes, what did we find? BME academics were more likely to consider a move overseas than their white counterparts, but they also went on to reject the idea. The US was considered the most desired destination, but again, I don't know if that would be the case now with Trump, because this was pre-Brexit and pre-Trump, so it may well be that our findings would be different. So caution there, a footnote. Excuse me. Arab, Jewish, Hispanic, Latin and other individuals who identified as other would consider Europe, and the biggest deciding factor was the offer of a full-time permanent post. So one of the things that was quite shocking, actually, which I thought was shocking anyway, as did my research assistants, was that the number of our respondents that were on 0 hours contracts. So they were, I think we worked it out that one of the respondents, the number of hours that she worked, she was getting paid £5 an hour. So that was something that we wanted to sort of make more light of, but couldn't because of the way in which the study itself was framed, and I think that probably is still the case now about 0 hours contracts. So they did, however, say that there were positive elements of working in UKHE, so it wasn't all negative. Having a full-time job, having a good pension, though I'm not so sure that's the case now, being treated with equity, a cooperative working environment, and having a family-friendly policies. And family-friendly policies were considered to be one of the most significant aspects of working in HE, because many of our respondents, not all women, men as well, said, well, actually, I can drop my child off at school, I can go and teach, and I can pick my child up at 3:30, and my managers are quite good in terms of being flexible. So that was considered a very positive thing. In terms of the push factors, all of our BME academics said that they felt that they had to be twice as good as their white colleagues, and they said that there was this notion that they were made to feel that higher education was a white space reserved for whites only. So it was almost like imposter syndrome. So there were visitors in this space that they were not allowed to be in. And many of them talked about promotion, where they got to a certain level. For instance, it was level 6, either reader or senior lecturer, and they couldn't get to professor. And they said that whilst there are these specific criteria that need to be met, what happens is it's often based on what your face looks like and who you know, which was very depressing. So the barriers to promotion, as I've just said, that was the career hits the buffers. So all of our respondents were very ambitious, and they did all want to get their chairs, but they felt as though this was an illusion. It was something that they themselves they didn't think that they could get. And I've shown you the statistics in terms of the numbers of professors that are black. There's only 80 in the whole of the UK. Again, the notion of it being a nebulous criteria, being judged more harshly. And some of our respondents, though not all of them, did work on race and equity, ethnicity and social justice. And this kind of work was seen as deficit. It was seen as personal research. Oh, it's not really real research. It's just, Kalwant, it's just something you're interested in because you're a non-white academic. Many of the individuals felt as though the REF disadvantaged them because they felt that many of them, though not all of them, again, were doing research in the Indian subcontinent or in Africa, and they were publishing in these kinds of journals that were located in those spaces. So they felt that they would be graded lower. Their work would be graded lower compared to the US or European journals. So they felt that they were disadvantaged in the REF. And indeed, there is evidence to show from the last research exercise that BME academics were disadvantaged and less likely to be entered for the REF, for all sorts of different reasons. So the academic reasons were, again, I talked very briefly about 0 hours contracts. So the most attractive thing was just to get work. If they couldn't get work in the UK, even if they got work temporarily, they would like to have gone overseas. Many of them said that there was a support, and the ones who were actually there, much more supportive environment for BME scholars. Particularly in relation to positive messages that they had received. And, having just come back from New York from the AERA, the American Educational Research Association annual conference, it certainly felt very safe to talk about these kinds of issues. And there's a whole scholarly body of work and academics where this kind of work that we do here is completely acceptable and the norm. So there is this notion that there's and many of our respondents said that there's an academic elite in the US, and there are courses, specific degrees on African American studies. There are black-only colleges and universities in the US. So in that respect, the US, for many of our academics, was considered to be a desired destination. So as I've said there, they felt they would be intellectually treated as an equal, credibility and status given to them, an institutional space, a supportive environment. There's no RAE or REF in Australia or indeed the US, less of an administrative burden, and of course better pay, terms and conditions. So in terms of lifestyle, quality of lifestyle for families was considered important. There was also the notion that there's a different culture in the US. It was much more accepting, much more collegiate. And one of our respondents said, in the USA, we go out to dinners together. There's always a sense of wanting to talk to everybody in the corridors. That's a culture that I value and I also like. And of course, better weather. Who wouldn't want better weather? Having the opportunity to travel and learn different languages. Some of our respondents, specifically those from Africa, China and India, said that they wanted to go back to their ancestral homes to give something back to their ancestral communities, which was considered to be a significant factor for them as to why they would leave. Okay, so I've kind of given you, I hope, I've taken you on a journey, I do hope. So I've given you kind of the statistics and the background, and I've shown you a study that demonstrates this. And now I'm going to try and end on a positive note in terms of how we can move forward with all of these issues and what we should be doing in higher education to make it a much more inclusive environment so that we represent the communities that we serve, because we don't do that at the moment. So we need greater visibility of BME staff in academic and decision-making roles. We need transparency in the recruitment and progression. I suggest a quota system for BME staff, actually. I'd like to hear your views on these things. We need formal networking, mentoring and training, specifically, or at the very least, for individuals who sit on promotion and progression panels. So if you haven't had mandatory unconscious bias training, you shouldn't be allowed to sit on any of these panels. Or indeed, it should be mandatory for whole institutions. But I know that this is why I want to hear your views on this. I know that will probably create a backlash. So at the very least, I suggest that. We need annual reviews which provide evidence on how our education institutions have addressed the BME attainment gap in their institutions. And you're probably sitting there saying, well, actually, they do that anyway, but they don't. And not all universities have formal mentoring schemes in place. I know, because I visited, well, I just know. Take my word for it. Not all universities have formal mentoring in place. Not all universities provide annual reviews on their BME attainment gap. So again, I suggest a quota system for BME students in Russell Group and elite higher education institutions. I think we should link the Race Equality Charter mark to funding. So universities who do not or are unable to demonstrate how they have addressed racial inequality in their organisation should not be awarded any funding. The Athena Swan Charter, when it was announced that the Athena by the NHIR, the National Health Institute for Research, is that the right one? Well, that one. When they announced that the Athena Swan Charter was going to be linked to funding for biomedical research, so institutions who are not signed up to the Athena Swan would not be able to apply, the number of universities that applied for the Athena Swan increased by 400% in that week. So money doesn't talk, money screams. So we've done it for the Athena Swan. Let's do it for the Race Equality Charter. Why one and not the other? And finally, I haven't forgotten about it, but universities really must acknowledge and address institutional racism and white privilege, because a failure to acknowledge results in a failure to act. Okay, so I can't possibly leave without saying something about Trump and Brexit, can I? Definitely not. So, forgive me, I just wrote these down yesterday, so I'm going to read it because I can't remember what I had written. I can remember the gist of it, but anyway, the biggest threat, in my opinion, post-Brexit and post-Trump to higher education is the attack on a social justice and inclusive agenda. So we know, as I discuss in my new book, that Brexit, I talk about the ways in Brexit was based on a discourse, and indeed Trump won the election on a discourse that blamed the other, the outsider. Immigration and fear of the other was used as a main reason for Brexit. But as I show in my new book, that this discourse was wrong, but also it was inaccurate in terms of how it was used. But what this has done is that it has seriously threatened the sustainability and future of higher education as an agent of change and how it contributes to issues of social justice. So we as educators, me, you, all of us, we've got a moral responsibility, I argue, to question and continually challenge what Brexit and Trump mean for our education agenda, particularly in relation to, number one, funding priorities, a competitive research market, and the future viability and sustainability of how we make sure that higher education is inclusive. So I think that we are confronted with various very serious complexities in a fluid, unpredictable political and social climate. We live in troubled times marred by risk, insecurity and indeed fragility. And as educators, we must stand firm in our right in order to ensure that a rich and diverse community of internationalisation brings an education system that is a strength and not a weakness. So we must continue to fight for an educational agenda that centres social justice, it centres inclusion and it centres diversity. And I suggest that we refute the claim from our Prime Minister that if you believe you are a citizen of the world, you are a citizen of nowhere. Thank you.